Hey everybody, Will Miles here with Read and Reaction. Been a little while since I've done this. I'm actually going to go back and re-record or record a couple of the articles that I've had up on the site for a couple of reasons, holidays and a couple of things going on here at home. Haven't been able to do that, but I'm going to go back. Some of them I think over the last few weeks have been relevant, and so for those of you who listen to these things on YouTube, you'll be able to get that there. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right into the article again. For those of you who are unaware, readandreaction.com is the website. One of the requests that we got from the YouTube channel was to read the articles from Read and Reaction for those people who can't necessarily go over there and read it. Either they're listening to it while they're in their car or they just enjoy listening to it. And so we're trying to provide that sort of content for all of you all. So if you want to support us more, you can go over to readandreaction.com, check out the articles, click on the advertisements there. That helps us out. Also, if you can like and subscribe to the YouTube channel, that helps us out as well. And then finally, if you really want to support us, you can go over to patreon.com/read and reaction. For as little as $2 a month, you can get a little bit of extra content. And certainly, we're going to be having more coming as we go. Last year, we put out a preseason magazine. We're going to be doing that again this year. For people who are Patreon subscribers, they got special compensation when it came to that preseason magazine. So head over there, support us over there, help us continue to bring out the preseason magazine. Hoping to have both a digital and a hard copy this year, but we'll see where that goes. Still in negotiations. So, with all that being said, the title of the article tonight is Florida Stagnant? Examining Billy Napier's recruiting 2 years in. This is a Dan Mullen recruiting class. I made that statement on last week's episode of Gators Breakdown, and a few fans reached out to say I was being unfair. Their contention was that I was putting too much emphasis on the Jaden Rashada saga, and that Napier has made overall improvements, even if recruiting isn't exactly where we want it to be. Perhaps the most interesting criticism I received was that I was being purposefully negative for clicks. That amuses me for two reasons. First, experience has taught me that you definitely don't get clicks by being negative about the program. Check out any of the mainstream Gator publications, and you'll figure out really quickly that they err on the side of being positive. But second, I hope that Napier really has made overall improvements in recruiting. I'm a Florida alum. I'm a fan, and I want the program to thrive. The problem is that when I look at the numbers, I don't see any substantial improvement to justify that hope. And since this website isn't close to my main source of income, I'm incentivized to tell you the truth rather than what generates clicks. Look, if you're lost in the woods, a map doesn't help you if you have no idea where you are. First, you have to determine where you are so you can determine a path to get out. So let's take a look, find out where we are on the map before deciding how to move forward. The Sykes standard. One of the pieces published on this site that I'm most proud of and referenced the most wasn't written by me. Back in 2008, colleague Bill Sykes looked at SEC coaches and what it took in their second or bump recruiting class to eventually win the conference. What he found was the following: an increase of 8.2 spots in the national rankings, an increase of 2.3 spots in the conference rankings, an average of 2.3 5-star recruits, an average national ranking of 4.7, an average conference ranking of 2.3, an average of 16.8 blue chips, 4 or 5-star recruits. That was the reason that I was perceived as negative when it came to Mullen's second recruiting class. I gave it a solid B, but also stated that Kirby was going to have to keep calling ill-advised fake punts if Mullen couldn't raise his recruiting to an A level. And now that Kirby's sniffing out fake punts and calling timeouts prior in playoff games, that's the level Florida needs. But it isn't what Florida is getting with Napier. In fact, Florida hasn't gotten that in a while, which we see if we look at Florida's last three coaches and their bump classes compared against the Sykes standard. So if the metric is 8.2 spot increase in national ranking, well, Mullen went from 14 to 9. Napier's gone from 18 to 13. 2.3 spot increase in conference rankings. Mullen went from 4th to 5th. Napier's gone from 8th to 6th. 2.3 5-star recruits. McElwain, Mullen, and Napier all got shut out in their second year. Average national ranking of 4.7, 12th for McElwain, 9th for Mullen, 13th for Napier, and then an average of 16.8 blue chip recruits, 9 for McElwain, and now 17 for Mullen and 17 for Napier. So that's the one place where they do meet, quote unquote, the Sykes standard. So tell me again, how is this recruiting class different than Mullen's? Yeah, there's a higher player rating. 91.87 actually upgraded to 92, a little bit over 92 now because there have been some re-rankings of the players versus 90.56. But the national ranking is worse, 13th to 9th, as is the conference ranking, 6th to 5th. They both have the exact same number of blue chip recruits and fail to reach the standard everywhere else. And because just about every blue chip player out there signed in December, there isn't much room to move anywhere but down by making additions prior to the February signing day. There is more green in the Jim McElwain column, but that's just because his transition class was so poor. This is now essentially 3 straight Florida coaches with very similar results. Grade inflation. But there's something else to consider here as well. When Bill was putting together his research, a blue chip recruit was essentially a top 300 player. Consider that in 2007, Mike Pouncey was the 279th overall player in the country, but was considered a 3-star, i.e., non blue chip prospect. This grade inflation has continued over the years for 2 reasons. First, I do think high school players are getting better as time goes on. But the other reason is that because it's exciting to announce that you've signed a 4-star player, and since a guy ranked 400th has about the same chance of succeeding as a guy ranked 300th, there's little incentive not to extend out those rankings. But the result is that quote unquote blue chip in 2023 doesn't mean the same thing as in 2005 or even 2020. The past 4 years, the lowest blue chip in the 24/7 sports composite has had the following national ranking: 2020, 373; 2021, 400; 2022, 426; 2023, 438. What this really means to me is you need to pick a defined bin of players, so the top 100 or the top 300, for comparisons rather than just using the term blue chip, because that term means different things in different years. I'm not going to go back over every SEC championship coach in that time, but I do think it's instructive to make the comparison of Napier and Mullen's first 2 recruiting classes, because we know that Mullen's classes weren't enough. So Mullen versus Napier, the 24/7 ranking, 90.71 for Mullen, 90.38 for Napier. Mullen wins. 11.5 national rank for Mullen, 15.5 for Napier. Mullen wins. Conference rank, 4.5 for Mullen, 7th for Napier. Mullen wins. Top 100, 8 players for Mullen, 4 for Napier. Mullen wins. Players ranked 101 to 300, 14 for Mullen, 12 for Napier. 5 stars, 0 for either of them. Commits, 44 for Mullen, 40 for Napier. We'll get to attrition in a minute, but on raw numbers on National Signing Day, Mullen beat Napier in every single category, whether it's top 100 players, top 300 players, number of commits, national ranking, conference ranking, or average player ranking. The only feather Napier has in his cap is that his 2023 recruiting class has a higher player rating than Mullen's 2019 bump class. But Mullen had a better transition class by far. But what about attrition? The minute you show a table like that, people get very upset because that 2019 Mullen class was boosted by DeJuan Black, 151st overall player, Davey Hammond, 242, Wardrick Wilson, 372, none of whom made it to campus. Additionally, Jalen Jones, 306, and Chris Steele, 42, never made it to fall camp either. All that's true, of course. But you do have to admit that it does feel a little bit like deja vu with the departure of Jaden Rashada from this 2023 class. A California kid who commits but then doesn't make it to fall camp is a familiar saga in Gainesville. Just this time, it's at the most important position on the field and has a weird NIL controversy attached. But let's give this the best possible spin for Napier and company and look at his recruiting versus Mullins in the first 2 seasons without those 5 players. The loss of those 5 would have dropped Mullins' transition class to 16th. But even with that, Mullen still ends up with a higher average player rating, a higher national rank, a higher conference ranking, more top 100 players, and an equal number of players ranked between 101 to 300 in both of their first 2 classes. The only place that Napier wins is in total number of commits. But averaging 20 players per class isn't really something to write home about. You can argue that Napier's bump class is slightly better than Mullen's, and I think you're probably right. And given the success of Kamari Wilson, Shamar James, and Trevor Etienne, it may just be that Napier is a better judge of talent overall. But it's difficult to make that determination at this point. Kyle Pitts, the 2018 class, started out slow, but turned into an absolute monster. Damian Pierce made a similar impact, 69 rushed, 424 yards, to Etienne, 118 for 719 in his freshman season. Richard Garage made 42 starts, including manning left tackle for the past 2 seasons. Where we can make a determination at this point, though, is that while Napier has taken a different approach than Mullen, he hasn't substantially upgraded the talent level of the roster over his 2 recruiting cycles thus far. That just doesn't show up in the data. Expectations. Of course, this has been in the cards for a while now. I've written repeatedly about how the average player rating that you have heading into the season, end of August, usually plays out by the time National Signing Day comes. For example, you sign more players, but rarely do you see a distinct bump in player quality. Below is the graph I showed when I wrote about it this past August. This graph pretty much tells the story, as there is a lot of volatility in the average player rating prior to August, but then the lines pretty much straighten out. Florida was at an average player rating of 91.86 heading into the season and stood at 91.87 when I wrote this. Again, now a little bit over 92. Yes, the loss of Rashada does impact that, but that difference is really relatively minimal. Rashada's commitment was more significant because of his position on the field and how much Florida has struggled there than for the numerical addition to the class. If it's true that the quality of early commits portends where our class ends up, though, then that's great news early on for Florida's 2024 class. While the Gators only have now four commits thus far, three of them now or two of them are top 30 players, Miles Graham and DJ Lagaway. And the third, running back Chauncey Bowens, is a top 300 player. And Florida just added a guy ranked 65th or 61st, I think, as a linebacker just the other day. Certainly, the class needs to be filled out, but Lagway and Graham are already ranked higher than any Napier recruits have been to this point. And Lagway is the quarterback that Gators fans hope will turn around the program in a big way, and is the only way the Gators win big with the 2022-2023 level of recruiting. But that's the thing about expectations. They don't get any lighter now that we've gotten two recruiting classes in. The expectation at Florida is to win, and Napier is going to have to do that soon while also picking up things on the recruiting front. I had sky-high expectations for the 2023 class because the state of Florida was loaded. Had Napier been able to get 25 players that he wanted within 150 miles of Gainesville, the class would have consisted of 3 5-star players, 7 top 100 players, and 10 players rated between 101 to 300. The average player rating would have been 93.17, fourth nationally, and generated 298 points, also fourth. Essentially, he would have met the Sykes standard easily. Instead, Florida's highest-ranked recruit from the state is the 22nd best prospect, Aiden Mizell, 96th overall. There are 7 5-star recruits in the 2024 class from the state. Florida isn't currently listed as a favorite for any of those 7. If we're talking about expectations in recruiting, that needs to change. Takeaway. I actually went into this article thinking that the folks criticizing me were correct. I was being slightly hyperbolic when I called the 2023 class a Mullen class because I have seen progress from the initial transition class to this one. But the problem isn't that Jaden Rashada is no longer in the fold. The problem is that the best way to evaluate recruiting is by evaluating a class or even classes as a whole. When doing that for the first 2 years of the Dan Mullen and Billy Napier eras, you can't escape the fact that the talent level in the program hasn't gone up. I want to be clear that this doesn't mean that Napier is doomed or that Florida will never beat Georgia. Florida was very good in the first 3 years of the Mullen era and beat Georgia as recently as 2020. But if the goal of the program is to consistently compete with Georgia and Alabama, that isn't going to happen based on what's been accomplished so far in the Napier era any better than it did during the Mullen one. And yes, Napier could use the transfer portal to rectify that situation. But you could say the same thing about Mullen, who hit with Van Jefferson, Trevon Grimes, Adam Schuler, and Jonathan Grenard through the portal. The problem with Mullen's strategy was actually at quarterback. If you're not going to recruit at a high level overall, you better bring in a bunch of quarterbacks and have one pan out. Mullen got lucky and caught lightning in a bottle with Kyle Trask. But even though he signed at least one quarterback in every class that he brought in, Emory Jones in 2018, Jalen Jones in 2019, Anthony Richardson in 2020, and Carlos Del Rio and Jalen Kitna in 2021, none of them became stars. That's really the issue with Graham Mertz coming in as a transfer. He might be a perfectly serviceable quarterback in Billy Napier's offense, but serviceable only works when you're Kelly Bryant with a stacked Clemson defense. Florida needs a star at the position, whether that's Mertz, Max Brown, Jack Miller, or eventually DJ Lagway. Napier has to hit, because the numbers say that the talent level in Gainesville right now is at the exact same level as it was under Dan Mullen. So that's my take on recruiting right now. Obviously, some issues there. I did want to correct one thing that was in the article. Again, specifically, I mentioned that Florida is now up to 92.04 overall in its 24/7 player rating. And that really is because Jakeem Jackson, the cornerback out of Kissimmee, has upgraded considerably. They've got him up to 55th in the nation, 97.42. Kelby Collins has gone up as well, up to 42nd. So Florida now has 2 top 100 guys in the class who are really going to be good. And I think that's one of the things that we need to say is that when we criticize recruiting as a whole, we're not criticizing any of these players. Many of them are going to turn out to be stars. Many of them are going to turn out to be starters. And I think when we look at what happened last year, the defense can't get much worse. And so, look, the team is going to be better in the coming years under Billy Napier. The question is, are they going to be able to compete with Alabama and Georgia? And that's why I had a whole section on expectations, because we shouldn't have expectations right now that we're going to compete year in, year out with Georgia and Alabama. And the expectations really need to be, hey, let's start defeating Kentucky. Let's start defeating Vanderbilt. Let's start defeating those sorts of teams, because the there isn't the data that suggests that Florida is going to be able to make this giant jump. Now, maybe DJ Lagway helps them do that. And if Lagway comes in, he's a star, well, then, that really is like the Clemson model is something that people talk about all the time. Now, there's some problems with that, namely that Clemson was the second best recruiting program in the ACC, and that Florida State sort of took a nosedive. And when they did, Clemson was there to take a step up. And if you look at winning percentage versus your conference ranking, it tends to be pretty linear. And especially when you're in the top two, those two teams tend to have a lot more success. So I think it's hard to compare to the Clemson model. At the same time, look, if you got a great quarterback, we saw it with Tennessee last year with Hendon Hooker. He can overcome a multitude of sins elsewhere. Now, is that good enough to win the SEC? Maybe, maybe not. Is it good enough to make the playoff? Maybe, maybe not. But Tennessee was one bad performance away from making it to the playoff last year with an elite quarterback. And so if Florida can get that sort of play, if the defense can improve, the Gators can certainly get there. I do want to address a couple of things. People had some comments on Twitter when I published this on the website. I think it's worth addressing. I tried to address it in the article, but I didn't go too in depth. One was that you can't compare recruiting rankings of Dan Mullen to Billy Napier because of the transfer portal, and that the transfer portal has changed everything. Well, there's a couple of things there. One is that there are transfer portal ratings out there, and Florida is not at the top of those transfer portal ratings either. And so, um, I think if Napier was just raking in guys who were who were in the transfer portal, then we'd say, okay, yeah, like maybe that can make a difference. The other thing is for all of the um, for all of the hoopla for for all the hoopla around Dan Mullen and his recruiting, he was really, really good on the transfer portal side. But if you look, so Florida's ranked 15th right now on the transfer portal, 10 commits, average of 88.78. Certainly Keontae Goodwin there coming in from Kentucky as a 5-star or close to 5-star left tackle is the jewel of that class. But look, LSU's number one when it comes to the transfer portal, 11 commits, 90.82. Florida State has 9 at 91.44. Colorado is 23 at 88.54. Certainly Deion Sanders using the portal to his advantage. USC 12 at 90.6, Oklahoma 12 at 90.1, Miami 8, 90.50, and Oregon 10 for 90.38. So you start looking at the teams that are in front of Florida in the transfer portal. They're all bringing in guys who have a higher overall rating. Now, again, there is an evaluation component to this at some point. These recruiting services have evaluated these players and set those ratings. Maybe they're wrong. Maybe the transfer portal is a bigger deal. But, look, Florida's bringing in 10 transfers, but Florida's also losing a ton on the field as well. And so, Dan Mullen was successful with recruits. In fact, was more successful than maybe others, especially early on. I struggle to see how the transfer portal is more than supplemental. That I think you can build a baseline. I'm not sure that you can actually build a full roster with that. I think if you go in with expectations that the transfer portal is going to give you stars, I think you're probably going to be disappointed. So the second criticism that I heard for the article was that NIL has completely changed the game, and there I actually do agree that NIL has completely changed the game. I don't think that matters, though, when we're actually analyzing the classes. So the reason for the lack of talent, or for identical talent, or maybe slightly less talent than Dan Mullen brought in his first 2 years for Billy Napier, is important, and we should talk about that. And there might be justifications for it and very good reasons for it. I don't know. The fact that Jaden Rashada left the program when he did, and that it was under the auspices of an NIL snafu, is something that Dan Mullen probably wouldn't have had to deal with, right? That the people who were leaving the program under him were leaving for reasons that had nothing to do with NIL, and you lose Rashada because of NIL and potentially some other recruits. Specifically, the more vocal ones seem to have been the ones who've headed towards Miami. At least that's been the Twitter the Twitter theme out there. That's not what I was saying in the article. It's just not. And the article is specifically just saying, what is the talent level in Gainesville? And we know what talent level is necessary to win. In fact, that talent level has probably gone up a little bit in terms of what's necessary to win in the SEC, given Brian Kelly coming into LSU, given that you got Hugh Freeze coming into Auburn, given that Josh Heupel just got a big extension and Tennessee is putting together a pretty professional NIL. program over there to help them recruit. So you start looking at where Florida lies in the SEC pecking order, and just staying at the same level has sort of taken them down. And that's indicative by I've heard a lot of people talk about Billy Napier having a higher average player rating. I've talked about him having a higher average player rating than Dan Mullen ever did. That's a good thing. The problem is that he's actually lower in the conference rankings and lower in the national rankings than Mullen was in his second year. And so proportionally to where the other teams are, Florida's struggling. Now, is that Napier's fault? I think we can have a discussion about that, but that's not what the article was about. The article was about, hey, the total level of talent here in the first 2 years equals the total level of talent for Dan Mullen. It's not criticizing Napier in terms of, hey, you need to do something different, or hey, you're as bad as Mullen, or anything like that. It's just pointing out the fact that those two things are equal. And I'm sure I'll be talking about it in the future in terms of what would be different. In fact, I've got an article that I posted about a month ago that I think is still relevant in terms of what would I do in terms of building an organization overall. But NIL is here. It's here. It's here to stay. We know what kind of talent level you need to win. And irrespective of whether you're short on resources, short on money, don't have the organizational structure, don't want to pay players, don't want to pay players big sums, want players all making an equal amount on the roster, whatever it is, it's irrelevant when it comes to whether this roster, as it's constructed and as it's being constructed, is going to be able to compete year in, year out for SEC championships. I'm doubtful that it will be based on what we've seen in the first couple of years. Again, though, that 2024 class, and people have said this, and I just don't know, is they've sort of said, is the 2024 class like a bump class, with early signing day and NIL, has a bump class been moved back? I don't think so. I think what you can do is you can maybe pool your resources in one particular year to go for broke. And if you've got Lagway in that class and you think he's the guy who's going to take you to the promised land, then you try to spend as much as you can around him to build that class so that you can cluster all those guys together. Now, that's a big bet, right? I mean, you're betting that that team is going to bring you to prominence for multiple years to a point where you'll be able to turn that into the ability to recruit year over year over year over year. I don't know that that's probably the best way to do it. But, I mean, at the end of the day, flags fly forever, right? If Billy Napier wins a national championship and then goes someplace else, we'll all be happy for it. If Billy Napier wins a national championship in between a bunch of 10-3 seasons, we'll also all be very happy about it, right? And so there are different approaches. You can take different approaches. I think NIL is going to prove that there need to be different approaches for this sort of thing. But, the reality is I agree with you that NIL has changed the way recruiting is done. I just don't think that matters. And I think one of your jobs as a CEO of a company is to understand what's happening with the market and make adjustments. And so Napier needs to do that. And I think the 2024 season, maybe, or 2024 cycle where it sits right now, maybe is an indication that we're getting there. So anyway, thank you so much for listening to the article. Thank you for supporting us at readandreaction.com. Like I said, we're going to have a 2023 preseason magazine out. I think you'll find them actually more optimistic about the Gators 2023 prospects than most people, actually, as I've started looking at writing that and putting some stats in and those sorts of things. If you'd like to support us, like I said, go over to readandreaction.com, click on the article, leave a comment here in the YouTube, or leave a comment over on Read and Reaction. Certainly like and subscribe here on YouTube. And if you want to support us even further, go over to patreon.com/read and reaction. So thank you so much for the support. Thank you for listening to me read the article. And hopefully I'll have one up there in the next couple of days with one that we've had previously on the site. So thanks so much for your support. Go Gators.